Hi, I'm Yousef Munayyer, head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and your podcast host.
Hi, I'm Yara. I'm an assistant professor in global health management and informatics and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center.
Hi, I'm Hanna Alshaikh. I'm the Palestine project coordinator at Arab Center, Washington.
Hello, I'm Rami, Khouri, non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center based in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Welcome, everyone, to another Hiwar episode of this podcast. Hiwar is the Arabic word for dialogue or discussion, and in each of these episodes, I, along with my Arab Center colleagues, discuss some of the big issues of the day. Folks, last time when we chatted, we talked about Israel breaking the ceasefire in Gaza. We touched a little bit on Israeli domestic politics and how that's playing into some of the decision-making here. And also the crackdown on dissent here in the United States. Since then, things have only gotten more gruesome in Gaza. More recently, there is news that the Israeli military intends to expand what it's calling a buffer zone by forcing even more people out of Rafah and potentially razing any remaining structures there. Hanna, I wanted to start with you. Can you talk us through what we are hearing so far about this and what it might mean on the ground?
Sure. As you referenced, Yousef, Israel announced recently that it plans to expand its offensive into Rafah and its ground occupation to create a new security corridor named the Marag Corridor, which is named after an Israeli settlement that was in Rafah during Israel's occupation from 1967 to 2005. It runs from east to west, and the purpose of this corridor is to essentially block off Rafah from the rest of the Gaza Strip. Now, we already have the deteriorating corridor that separates northern Gaza from southern Gaza, so south of Gaza City and north of major towns like Deir al-Balah. But now there's a new corridor that might be established here to cut off Rafah from the rest of Gaza. So we have to remember that Rafah was once the so-called safe zone for much of the early months of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. At one point, there were over 1 million Palestinians believed to be sheltering there. It had become one of the most densely populated cities on earth. And in May of 2024, Israel launched its incursion into Rafah. It was extremely violent and displaced those Palestinians out of Rafah. But in the last 2 weeks alone, after this temporary ceasefire, Palestinians returned to their homes or the rubble of their homes in Rafah to look for the bodies of loved ones and to find what's left of their belongings. In that period, people started coming back to this town. And now in the last 2 weeks alone, Israel displaced something like 140,000 Palestinians from Rafah. And destroyed. Now at this point, we've seen that Rafah has lost something like 90% of its homes due to Israeli bombardment. At least 20,000 buildings have been destroyed, and the entirety of its civilian infrastructure has essentially been decimated. Most farmland has also been destroyed, and this is all according to local sources. So what does this signal? It signals the total elimination of an entire city and an entire governorate, one that is historic. It further signals Israel's sustained intention to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And we know that Netanyahu has the permission of the Trump administration to do this. So it's not a question of if for the Israelis, but when. But the thing that stands out here that we should remember is that if, with Trump's permission, if Israel were able to send Palestinians into Egypt, which is where they would be sent in this scenario, it would have happened already. And so what's really clear here is that Egypt has been sticking to its guns, that the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians into Egypt is a red line. And this really could signal the end of the Camp David Accords. In some ways, Israel's narratives are coming full circle. It's invoking the names of its former settlements and how it names corridors to impose violence and to impose its genocidal war on Palestinians. These settlements were set up in 1967, or they started to be established in 1967 with the onset of Israel's occupation. And from 1967 until 1973, it had also occupied the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. And the Camp David Accords were negotiated at the end of the 1970s to bring an end to this state of war between Egypt and Israel, negotiate what was called a separate peace. And it's quite interesting that as Israel is invoking the same language and the same imagery that it had at the onset of some of the fiercest moments of its conflict with Egypt, it's using these terms again. But it's also a reminder, and I think these reminders are necessary all the time, that this did not start on October 7th. And, in fact, it did not start in December of 1987 with the establishment of Hamas. We should also remember that Israel briefly occupied Gaza from 1956 to 1957. And to talk about Rafah again, committed a horrific massacre in Rafah and a horrific massacre in Khan Yunis. In 1956, killing something like 330 Palestinians at minimum at that time. And so in so many ways, this violence is coming full circle. And to talk about massacres more, I think that the situations and the new instances are quite endless. So I'll leave it there for others to pick up.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Hanna, that you talk about how Rafah at earlier stages of this campaign was considered the safe zone. Like, so much of the focus earlier on of the military operations was basically the Israelis focusing on the north end of Gaza and pushing everybody south towards Rafah. And there was a huge concentration of Palestinians in Rafah at that time. And of course, they continue to be forced from one place to the next seeking safety. And we know, if anything is true, that there is no safe place in Gaza, and there's no safe person in Gaza, even if you are medical personnel. And we saw very recently news coming to light about a massacre of Palestinian medics who were going to rescue people who were injured. And they were effectively executed and had their remains buried in a mass grave by the Israeli military. Yara, can you talk to us about exactly what happened here and kind of put it in the context of the risks that people who are trying to save lives face throughout this campaign, and also maybe say something a little bit about how we learned about this and how the news has come out over time?
Yeah, thank you, Yousef, for bringing that to our attention. When we consider the scale of atrocities over the past 18, 19 months, we could have a daily podcast just covering those, and we still would not be able to get through all of them. Those who are following on social media are well aware of this. But sometimes there's an incident that is so horrific, despicable, grotesque, even, that it breaks through. And this was one of those incidents. As you know, attacks on healthcare and healthcare workers, healthcare infrastructure is commonplace in Gaza. It's been a commonplace in Gaza since long before October 7th. All previous wars in Gaza included attacks on hospitals, ambulances, paramedics, etc. In this current period, we've seen hundreds of healthcare workers, paramedics, aid workers that have been killed, multiple hospitals bombed. I could go on and on about that. So this incident, while again so exceptional in just, again, how grotesque it is representative of an entire campaign of attacks on healthcare that has been apparent. So what we know is that on March 23rd, around 6 a.m., there was a convoy of ambulances that was heading in the north through an Israeli checkpoint, and they had been in contact with their colleagues elsewhere in Gaza. This contact was lost during what their colleagues later said sounded like an attack, but there was no communication with this convoy after that period around 6 a.m., like I noted. And then efforts from other paramedics to go and see what was going on were thwarted or shot at by the Israelis. Ultimately, what came to light was this mass grave, as you noted. And once this was found, the initial Israeli narrative was that a drone operator flying a drone, had reported to the soldiers at a checkpoint that the Israelis had set up in the north that these vehicles were moving towards them in a suspicious manner. And the IDF said that the ambulances had been traveling with no headlights, no emergency lights, were not clearly identified as medical personnel. In this mass grave, they found 8 staff members from the Red Crescent, 6 from the Palestinian Civil Defense, 1 UNRWA employee killed. And this was the single most deadly attack on the Red Cross anywhere since 2017. So what then happened this past week was that a video was released through the New York Times that was recorded by one of these medics that was murdered by the Israelis. And you can clearly see exactly what happened, that the ambulance's lights were on, that they were clearly identified.
They
and
found
he's narrating.
They found the phone in the grave.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And he's narrating in this, long video, and there's a longer excerpt that was released by the Red Crescent, what's happening, but in between praying for his life, because these men knew that it seems that they were about to die. And his final words, as the video cut off, were this: the Israeli soldiers are coming. The Israeli soldiers are coming. So here we have this other situation where the initial Israeli narrative that this was completely justified is completely blown out of the water. Every aspect of what they said in terms of what happened to these paramedics was wrong. Now they have, of course, since said that 6 of these paramedics were actually members of Hamas. Of course, they will not identify which of those 6 that there are. Of course, they have provided no evidence to this. So this just seems like another attempt to kind of backtrack and say that, no, actually this clearly unjustifiable incidents was justified. And, when you consider this Israeli narrative that everyone they kill is either associated with Hamas or is a human shield, despite copious, decades of evidence that this is untrue. This just appears to be another justification for this purposeful killing. And the Red Crescent said in a statement that in 50 years, Israel has yet to prove that a single Red Crescent ambulance or crew has carried or used weapons. So a spokesman for the Red Crescent is now saying they're calling for an independent and impartial international commission of inquiry into these circumstances. Some countries like Australia have come out in support of this. And I want to emphasize as I close here that this is just yet another incident just recently of this well-established pattern that Israel says something and then audio evidence, video evidence comes out that they were completely incorrect, that they were lies. We can think of the case of Hind Rajab, of Shireen Abu Akleh, of the command and control center that they were supposed to find under Al-Shifa. All of these, the narrative was completely blown away. And in all of these cases, there was no accountability, no justice. And so, of course, we're going to continue to see this. We don't know yet what outcome there will be from this, but with the current administration, it's likely that nothing will happen.
Yeah, it seems like the key problem here is and continues to be that there is no accountability and that the Israelis feel that they could, literally just pretend international law doesn't exist, pretend that, accountability for war crimes is not something that they will ever face. Of course, we know that the International Criminal Court has issued indictments for war crimes against the Israeli prime minister, against his former defense minister. And despite that, recently, the Israeli prime minister flew into Europe, where he visited a ICC party state in Hungary. The red carpet was rolled out for him by Viktor Orban, a right-wing nationalist leader in Hungary who himself has been carrying out a string of sort of assaults on liberal norms and practices in Hungary and beyond. And Orban came out and announced that not only are they welcoming Netanyahu, but they plan to withdraw from the ICC altogether. And so it's not the war criminals that are a problem. It's anyone trying to hold them accountable, at least according to the leader of Hungary. It's not clear that other European countries share that view. Netanyahu left from Hungary, came to Washington, D.C., and in the process had to avoid flying over certain European countries because they weren't sure whether or not the prime minister could be apprehended over that airspace. But other European countries have kind of sent mixed signals, saying that they wouldn't necessarily, invite Netanyahu, but they don't think that they would arrest him. Different officials in the same countries have had different things to say. So Europe, which has been such a proponent of not just international law, but the regime of international legal organizations which were supposed to uphold these laws, doesn't seem to know how to handle this. And it's coming at a time, of course, when not just international law is under attack in Europe. But Netanyahu comes here to Washington. It was kind of a surprise visit. It was something that happened fairly abruptly. It wasn't very, very clear what the trip was about. There was some speculation that it was about obviously what continues to be going on in Gaza. There was speculation that it could be about the U.S. relationship with Iran and its sort of efforts to deal with the nuclear issue there, or about the fact that the U.S. president is planning a trip to the Middle East in May, and even could have been about the new set of tariffs that the Trump administration has announced that would include Israel as well, affecting U.S.-Israel trade relations. So all of this was kind of circulating around this meeting. And the meeting happened very, very quickly. And a couple of interesting things came out of it. And I'd love to get sort of reactions to this. I mean, one of the things that came out of it in the press availability between Trump and Netanyahu were some comments that Trump made towards Netanyahu, in particular about what's happening in Syria. Of course, recently the Israelis have conducted a series of strikes in Syria, some of which they have explained as targeting Turkish interests in Syria. And that they did not want to see Turkey establish some kind of military foothold in Syria. And President Trump, seated next to Netanyahu, basically said, look, we know what's going on there. We know you guys are not happy about it in Israel, but we're going to work this out, especially if you can be reasonable, right? Looking at Netanyahu, he says, if you can be reasonable, right? You got to be reasonable. Now, that was kind of an interesting moment because I think, number one, it caught Netanyahu off guard, but also put him in a very unfamiliar position, a position where a U.S. president really puts the onus on him for conflict and failure to advance stability and peace. Usually, the U.S. president is playing the other role of making sure everybody else is considered to blame for that and not the Israelis. So I wonder, what do you folks make of that, Rami? I'd like to turn to you here. What are we seeing happen in this great game in Syria, and how do you interpret this exchange between Trump and Netanyahu?
Well, all of these issues really come together this week. It's fascinating. The meeting in Washington, the Turkish situation, Syria, even Lebanon, Iran, and Gaza, the genocide. Of course, all of these things have to be seen as part of one dynamic. To me, the most interesting thing was the Washington meeting in the White House could be a turning point, in at least short term, a turning point in the relationship between Israel and the U.S. on Middle East issues. Historically, the Israelis have gotten virtually everything they want from the U.S. There's only one area where the U.S. maintained some of its own decision-making, which was on Iran. And of course, they did the JCPOA some years ago. The Israelis didn't want it, but the U.S. did it. And we may be seeing that again now, but we can conclude a few things. from all of these things together, and then I'll say something about Washington and Syria. But first of all, you can't trust almost anything the Israelis say. And that's for two reasons. Because one, we know they lie and exaggerate and try to deflect. And they did that with the ambulance attacks and other things. The second thing is we know they don't have a clear strategy. Their genocide in Gaza is not linked to a clear process of political steps ahead. All they know how to do is to keep attacking Palestinians, make life miserable, try to drive them out of Palestine. They've been doing this since 1925, and they haven't succeeded. In that context, when the U.S. suddenly, in a big, high-profile meeting like this, more or less lays down the law, so look, we're going to handle Turkey and Syria, we're dealing with Iran, and Trump also didn't mention Gaza much at all, except for some very emotional comments on the Israeli hostages. And of course, anybody who's held hostage deserves emotional support by anybody in the world, but you can't separate the hostage taking or the prisoners from the wider political context. But Trump did that. And this is keeping the old US-Israeli relationship the same, that the US will support anything that Israel wants, including highlighting the pain of the hostages without any mention of the massively bigger pain of the Palestinians. So that's keeping the old US-Israeli relationship the same. But on the other side, Trump basically said, we're going ahead with the talks with Iran, and we will handle Turkey and trade. He didn't give any concessions on trade. So this is all really new stuff. I think one of the important points here that will emerge sometime in the next month or two is how willing is the U.S. to keep pursuing this separation of U.S. interests in the Middle East from Israeli interests in the Middle East. And this links to this new poll that just came out by the Pew, which I think we'll talk about maybe, but it shows the declining support for Israel in the U.S. Now a majority of Americans, 53%, have a negative opinion of Israel. And this has increased 11% in the last 2.5 years or so. This is a trend that's seen in Gallup polls, it's seen in public demonstrations, it's seen in congressional votes, you see it everywhere. There is a dynamic going on here where the Israelis, because of their excessive militarism and barbarism without a peacemaking coexistence strategy, have pretty much alienated most of the world and may be on the verge of alienating the American president, at least in one level of their actions. And the Turkey-Syria thing is the relationship is the most novel dimension of what's going on. And the Israelis bombed Syrian air bases near Aleppo in the north, saying that we want to make sure that the Turks don't come and use these bases, because the Turks had a delegation, military delegation, surveying bases in Syria to see where they could provide air defense systems and other things like that. And of course, if the U.S. is going to choose between having Turkey or Israel as your main Middle East ally, I imagine Turkey is probably more important in the long run, though in the short run, the Israelis can exert great political influence in Washington. So there's all these critical relationships that are fluid now, and this is itself is historic, because none of them have really been fluid in the past, and the Israelis must be very worried.
Yeah, a few things to keep in mind on the Syria front. I think people may recall that, of course, when the transition in Syria ultimately happened, the Assad regime fell. Of course, Syria has been going through an increasing period of being weakened for many, many years now. The Israelis taking full advantage of that over time, but they really took advantage of it during that period of transition where they conducted a really wide range of strikes throughout Syria targeting military infrastructure. So even if there was going to be a new government there, they really didn't have a lot to work with in terms of national defense. And someone is going to come in and fill that void. It's a question of who it's going to be. Perhaps the Israelis want it to be nobody because they'd rather see Syria in a constant state of chaos than stability.
Let me just add, sorry, if I can just add to this regional issue. Netanyahu went to Washington at a time when there was 5 or 6 active military confrontations that Israel was having in the region, and they've been expanding into Turkey and Iran, and the U.S. is being drawn into these. And this is something that Trump definitely does not want. He does not want to see the U.S. getting involved in more wars, especially a big war against Iran. So I think the realization has dawned on many people in the US, especially younger people. This is what the polling keeps showing, that there's a huge gap between older Americans like Biden, who got their news from CNN and CBS, and younger Americans who get their news from videos on YouTube and progressive news sources. There's a big difference in how people in the US look at Israel and look at the Palestinian. And the last Gallup poll showed that a majority, 55%, I think, of Americans want a Palestinian state to coexist with an Israeli state. So this trend is really frightening the Israelis. The U.S. went along with the Israeli trend of using military force everywhere in the region to keep Israel safe, and it hasn't made Israel safe. It's made it more vulnerable. So this is another factor to keep in mind as the U.S. looks at the region and says, hey, we don't want to fight wars all over the region. We just got out of Afghanistan. We don't want to get pulled in again.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Rami. Another thing, that very weird sort of occurrence that we saw in the last several days, which I think in any other administration would have been grounds for, a historic scandal. This individual named Laura Loomer, who is sort of a right-wing activist, very active in the social media space, huge sort of Trump supporter, well known for her rampant Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian attitudes, made an appointment with Donald Trump in the West Wing, showed up, told him that he thought he should fire several people on his national security staff, according to reporting that we've seen. And then the next day, several individuals from the National Security Council were dismissed. I mean, this is crazy town stuff. Even in a period of really unprecedented politics with the second Trump administration, but it seems like there is something of a brewing debate in MAGA world, if you will, around U.S. foreign policy, and which direction it should take. And this, of course, happens right before this meeting with Netanyahu, where Trump announces, seated next to Netanyahu, and it really did not look like Netanyahu knew that this was about to happen. That and maybe even the Iranians did not know that it was about to happen, that the U.S. and Iran were about to engage in direct talks over the nuclear issue at the end of the week. And so, I think this was really remarkable because, the Israelis had obviously objected very strongly to the JCPOA. They fought it tooth and nail, and they would have cried bloody murder if they did not have constant updates and advance notice of anything that the United States was doing with Iran. And here's Donald Trump seemingly catching Benjamin Netanyahu off guard. And Netanyahu, who has really dedicated years of his life to bringing the United States into confrontation with Iran, could do nothing but sit there and go along with it. So now it looks like there's going to be some pretty important conversations taking place in Oman, a country that is playing a role in mediating this issue between the United States and the Iranians. What do we see happening here? What are the prospects of this actually leading to success? There's also a tremendous amount of American military assets that have been moved into the region. It sure looks like something is coming to a head, and it's not exactly clear which way it's going to go. And it also seems like the Israelis are not fully happy with how it's going either. How do you all read into it?
I would agree with that. I would agree with the sentiment that Netanyahu was in fact caught off guard, although the there's been a flood of dismissals of this narrative in the Israeli media in the aftermath of this press conference. It really looked to me like Trump was returning the favor to Netanyahu for an embarrassment that he brought Trump in January of 2020. The crowning achievement of Trump's Middle East foreign policy in his first term was supposed to be the Peace to Prosperity Plan, sometimes called the Kushner Plan or the Trump Plan or the Deal of the Century in 2020, allegedly between Palestinians and Israel. And it was effectively sabotaged by Netanyahu when he was a guest of the White House in a public appearance with Trump. When he announced with Trump, just as they were preparing to unroll this plan, his intentions to annex the West Bank. This is in 2020. And allegedly, Trump was furious behind the scenes. And not allegedly, but it's confirmed fact from Trump himself. He was enraged by this. He was surprised by this news. And the administration then from this point pivots to the Abraham Accords and to Arab-Israeli normalization projects after this point, because the deal of the century was effectively sabotaged by Netanyahu in this meeting. There was little that Trump was willing to say publicly about that during his term, but in between his presidencies, he gave an interview to Barak Ravid from Axios where he says this. So I do think that favor was being returned. Trump was also adamant in his meeting that Iran has to stop funding the Houthis, and it has. And then, of course, Netanyahu added himself that they have to end their nuclear program. And of course, the White House spokespeople have also insisted on this point that Iran has to end its nuclear program. Today, it was also reported that the U.S. wants to expand Iran sanctions as well. So this meeting is going to take place, but to bring this back to U.S. public opinion and the narrative on tariffs, which the tariffs at this point, the effects have not been seen yet. The impact is not entirely seen on Americans. So there are many Republican voters or Trump voters who have their full trust behind the president and don't believe that this will be harmful to them in the long term. And so it's not surprising then that some of them might actually view these 17% tariffs that are to be levied on Israel, despite Netanyahu saying that he will work to adjust and to correct the trade deficit. He did not walk away with a promise or a guarantee from Trump that those tariffs would be removed. I think that this might be the leverage that Trump is using to end this war. I do think that's possible. I do think it's possible that this war is unpopular even with his base, or it's becoming increasingly unpopular with his base. And Trump is frustrated. I think we're seeing the rise of protests against Trump like this past weekend, and Palestine was part of it. It wasn't, the center of these protests, but it was part of it. And Trump is aware of that. And he's looking to end this war. And so, again, I don't think this is a fig leaf, these meetings, but it bears mentioning that even before the JCPOA, there were several points in which U.S. administrations, even Republican administrations, realized it was time for a change in U.S.-Iran relations, that it was time for a warming, it was time for negotiations and conflict resolution. And it was usually the role of AIPAC, and like Yousef, you'd mentioned earlier, Netanyahu himself, who worked against this. When the incoming Bush administration was preparing Clinton-era Iran sanctions, which were put forward at the insistence of AIPAC, were set to expire during this term, and there was a great deal of anxiety in Israel and within AIPAC about whether or not these sanctions would be renewed. And Colin Powell privately had reservations about whether or not this should happen. There was in their understanding, a link between conflict resolution, Israel-Palestine-wise, but also Iran-wise, and it was time to maybe start asking questions and opening up diplomatically. And it was AIPAC and Israel that thwarted this process altogether and set the region on a totally different trajectory as a result of this. So it wouldn't be the first time that Republican administrations want something different here, following the Iran Revolution in 1979. And so I do think big changes are coming, and I think some of you have picked up on this already. But there is something very different here, even in terms of the Trump-Netanyahu relationship.
Yeah, there was an interesting opinion piece in the Washington Post this week by the Iranian foreign minister, who kind of jumped on the opportunity after the comments by Trump at the meeting with Netanyahu about direct talks and so on, where it seemed like they were speaking in Donald Trump's language, talking about how they want this new relationship, that Iran would be open for business, that they'd be great for American investment, and that the evidence of this was one of the first things they did during the JCPOA period was buy, tons of money worth of stuff from Boeing, an American company. So it seems like the Iranians are trying the Trump approach and hoping that maybe that there can be a reset in the relationship here. I do want to touch on this poll, though, and we've talked about it a little bit, and I think it ties into so much of what we've discussed just now. We've been watching opinion polls on this issue for some time. And over the last decade and a half, the key story in these opinion polls on U.S. opinion around the U.S.-Israel relationship has been a partisan divide. And we started to see this at some point among the left end of the spectrum, among liberal Democrats. And then over time, it kind of became a majority of opinion among Democrats writ large, right? Liberals and moderates together. What's so interesting about this most recent Pew poll is that there's a huge shift in opinion among Republican identified respondents, particularly under the age of 50. And this is something that's different from what we've seen previously, because it suggests that this shift away from Israel in American public opinion is no longer simply characterized by partisan attitudes, that it's actually about something deeper that's starting to grow right now. And it can really change things here. And perhaps that might be one of the reasons why we're starting to see some of these debates among the right about what the U.S. relationship with Israel should be.
Can I jump in with a comment here? I've been spending time with a lot of political activists and analysts and people on campuses and activists, basically, who are demonstrating both against Trump's domestic excesses, but also against Palestine, genocide against Palestine. And the two are linked in various ways, but not in every way. And one of the important things that's happening is that after 18 months or so of the American-enabled Israeli genocide, more and more Americans, old and young, Democrat, Republican, these boundaries are being crossed now. More and more people see what's going on. And as the mainstream press also gets influenced more and more by the alternative press, people like Mondoweiss and Electronic Intifada and many others, and social media coming out, the mainstream press is now reporting a little bit more factually the bad things that Israel is doing. And finally, I think people are realizing that what the Israelis are pushing the United States to do could get U.S. into a big war with Iran, and at the same time, it's whittling away at the constitutional rights of American citizens, free speech, due process, things like that. This combination has wakened up a lot of Americans. The young people knew this before, but older Americans are starting to realize it, and some Republicans are starting to realize it. So again, there's a dynamic going on here that's new, and we don't know how long it'll continue and how far it will go. But clearly, there are bigger stakes now than the traditional ones that, we got to support the Israelis because they help us with the elections, or the strategic allies against the communists, or something. They were 30, 40 years ago. Now there's bigger problems that people are facing, and they're linking a lot of those to this unbridled support for Israel in the U.S.
Yeah, and I want to add, building off our conversation last time about the campus protests and the uptick in repression and detainment of people who are speaking up for Palestine or even wrote op-eds about Palestine. You only need to exercise that level of repression when you worry that your viewpoint is losing ground. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And, I think we also have to remember that views about the why differ. So we're seeing the outcome with the Pew poll, but I guarantee you that for many of these people, this has very little to do with human rights or Palestinian health or genocide. And as shocking as that might be, that hasn't been aligned just yet. But I think people are also, I'm seeing increasing, we're cutting funding here for libraries and school lunch, and we're cutting this and we're cutting that. And yet Israel can count on $4 billion from the United States every year. And so I think for some that are more right-leaning, a lot of their critiques come from that aspect. If it's America first, why are we seeing Israel being considered so frequently? Why are we seeing our Secretary of State and any number of politicians, wearing Israeli flags, having Israeli flags in their offices? We should be making decisions, and I'm speaking for this viewpoint, on what is best for us. And if Israel doesn't fit into that, we don't have an ideological reason to support them. That's our parents' generation. So I think we're seeing a mix of reasons that if current trends continue, bodes very poorly for Israel's public support. We have not seen it shoot up at any point in the last many decades. It's only going in one direction. So how does that bode for the increasing tension between what politicians are willing to do to defend Israel and what the populations that they're supposedly representing actually want them to do to represent them?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question right there, Yara, and I'm sure it's one that we're gonna keep our eye on moving forward, but it'll wrap us up for our conversation today. Thank you all, as always, and everyone who tuned in to another Hiwar episode.